love Mission Sunday because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my ministry, the ministry of Transworld Radio, and what God's doing around the world. I get very encouraged and excited in my heart when I start to think about how God is at work around the world, drawing people to Himself. And we know, reading through scriptures, that all nations, all peoples of the earth are on God's heart. And He is at work continually drawing people to Himself. And it's really a privilege for me to be involved in a ministry who's trying to do that through radio. And the ministry, of course, is called Transworld Radio. The mission statement, the purpose of Transworld Radio is to reach the world for Jesus Christ by mass media so that lasting fruit is produced. And that lasting fruit bit is very important, especially when you're in mass media, because it could sort of be that we put the signal out over the radio, we fire and forget, and just sort of blanket the signal out there. But we're really concerned with people hearing the message and then having life transformation, and then long term, over the course of their lives, growing in deeper knowledge of the scriptures and then becoming disciples of Jesus Christ. So how is it that Transworld Radio is doing this? Well, we have strategically placed high-power transmitters in various parts of the world that enable us to reach vast distances with our radio signals. And so how powerful are these transmitters? Well, if you were listening to your local CBC or the St. John the Rock or whatever it is you listen to, the transmitters that we use are at least 10 times and sometimes 100 times stronger than the transmitters the radio stations that you listen to here. So 1 million watts, 500,000 watts, that doesn't mean much, but those very, very powerful radio stations, and God has given those into our hands, and those are instruments that we can use to broadcast the gospel over long distances. Some of those transmitters we own and operate ourselves, and others of those transmitters we have bought large blocks of airtime on them, and it's really amazing. Some of those transmitters are in Muslim nations that are normally closed to openly preaching and teaching from the Bible, but God has miraculously given us outlets in some of those countries. Some of them are in countries like Sri Lanka, which is a Buddhist nation. And the Sri Lanka Broadcast Corporation has given us 6 hours every evening on their transmitters. Of course, we pay a lot of money for that, but it gives us a platform by which we can broadcast the gospel. Now, I've been with Transworld Radio for 38 years, and so Jasmine has been involved in that ever since she was born. My wife and I were working with Transworld Radio. But how did this whole thing start anyways? And on the next slide here, you see a picture of our founder, Paul Freed, and he's standing in front of a building. Paul Freed, back in the 1950s, he was working with Youth for Christ. He went to Europe on a sort of a missions conference type trip. And while he was there, he visited Spain. And this was the Franco era. Spain was under dictatorship. The Protestant church was under intense persecution in those years. And Spain was really close to openly talking about preaching the Bible. It was a closed nation in that respect. And he thought the best way to get the message of the gospel into Spain was to use radio. He just had that impressed on his heart. And so he came back to the United States and he raised the money and started up a small radio station across the Straits of Gibraltar in Tangier, Morocco, and then began to broadcast into Spain. And people really started to respond. The letters and the response started to pour in. Later, they added more transmitters and more antennas, and they actually began to broadcast into the Soviet Union. That was the Cold War era. And so again, people were hearing over the air a message that they normally didn't hear on the local radio stations or the local propaganda stations, and people really responded to that message. Many people came to faith through hearing the broadcasts. And then the government of Morocco went from a secular government to an Islamic government, and they kicked Transworld Radio out. The Voice of Tangier, it wasn't called Transworld Radio in those years, the Voice of Tangier, they kicked us out. And they also kicked out Voice of America and the BBC and anybody who was broadcasting a free sort of type of message. They kicked them out of the country. And where were we to go? In those days, radio was state-owned. There was no privately owned radio in Europe back in the 1950s. And so we were looking for someone who would let us broadcast. And we found a broadcast organization that would let us broadcast, and that was Radio Monte Carlo. And that was a miracle because Monaco was a very, very Catholic nation. And the fear was that a Protestant radio station coming in and wanting to go on the air, they would never allow us to do that. But miraculously, again, God worked, and Radio Monte Carlo said, yeah, I think we can make this work. Monte Carlo had been broadcasting to their troops, to the French troops in Indochina, and the French left the Indochina War, and so they had all of these transmitting facilities, and they were thinking, what are we going to do with this? And right then we came along and said, can we use your transmitting facilities for our programs? And so we entered into a long-term contract with Radio Monte Carlo. Now that building that you see there was actually designed by Albert Speer. That was Adolf Hitler's chief architect. This building was built by the Nazis in the Second World War because in the Second World War, the Nazis wanted to broadcast their propaganda to all of Europe, East and West Europe, and North Africa. And Hitler asked his engineers, where is the best place in the world to reach that area? And they said, geographically, that would be Monte Carlo. And so the Nazis built this broadcasting center in Monte Carlo. This building sits on a hill on the mountaintop just above Monte Carlo. If you've ever were there and you looked up on the mountain, that's where this transmitter building was. And that's where we eventually were able to broadcast from. The Nazis, by the way, didn't actually get on the air. The American Sixth Fleet sailed into the Bay of Monaco, and they fired shells up there and knocked it offline. They destroyed it pretty well. And after the Second World War was over, the French took the original blueprints from Albert Speer's blueprints and rebuilt the building. And that's where our transmitters were and could reach all over East Europe, West Europe, North Africa, and even into the Middle East from Monte Carlo. So in this next picture, you can see that this is our world coverage of our transmitters. And Dr. Freed's vision grew, and we began to build new stations, more stations, get into new outlets, so that today we're broadcasting on 275 languages, and we reach about 80% of the world's surface with our radio signals. And so this is a great and powerful tool for the message of the gospel. But many nations today are closed. And so people, when they think about radio, they think, well, isn't radio a little old-fashioned? I mean, everybody's listening to the internet today, and mobile phones and streaming and all that stuff. Isn't radio passé? Well, we still listen to radio, and we also still listen to the internet, and Transworld Radio is also using all of the internet and the streaming and the mobile apps. We have an app called TWR 360, and you can check that one out. It's got programming on it in over 100 languages and has a huge library of content, audio and video. So we are using the technology, but as I said, a lot of countries are really closed to the gospel. Some countries will block Christian stations, Christian content over the internet. Some countries like North Korea, on the next slide, there's this monument there in North Korea, and we hear about North Korea today and how closed that country is, and it really is closed. There are no churches, open legal churches today in North Korea. And how do you get a message to those people? We do it through radio. And how do people have radios? How do we know people are listening? Well, over the last 13 years, we have smuggled over 100,000 shortwave radio receivers into North Korea. There's an organization that will do that for us. And so we have built our own audience in North Korea. We smuggle the radios in, and we also smuggle in a devotional, a Bible study devotional. And the Bible study needs to be renewed because there's different sections to it. And the people inside the country ask us for about 58,000 devotionals whenever we want to update the content. So we feel that there's probably about 58,000 individuals and groups that are using the content. And then we have these radios that we've smuggled in. And these are not just people listening by themselves. They oftentimes will gather in small groups in basements and hidden areas and listen to the programming. If they're caught, then they're punished severely. And so this is a great risk, but we feel that everybody should have the opportunity to decide what it is they believe. And so we broadcast Korean programming. And on this next slide, you can see where we're doing that from. This is from our transmitter site on Guam in the Pacific. So this is where we broadcast to China, to Korea, and all of Micronesia, and all of the Asian countries. It's a shortwave site, and we have those antennas are focused on various countries, and we can switch different ones in and actually even slew the signal left or right to focus our signal in on the country that we're in the language that we're broadcasting. We broadcast to Japan, and of course our ministry in China is a really big part of our overall efforts to get the gospel out. And so right across that body of water is Asia. And those antennas are in operation every day, broadcasting Christian programming. And then on this next slide, you see another type of person in the world that is very, very difficult to reach these days. A lot of nations are not allowing people to openly teach the Bible, or it's very difficult to do so, or there's a lot of persecution if you do. And so our ministry to the Muslim world is a major focus of Transworld Radio. And on this next slide, you can see that part of the world that we're trying to reach right now. Where that area is highlighted there, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India, is one of the most difficult areas in the world today to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus Christ. You have to be very, very careful. And we recently, our country director for Pakistan was on his way to meet a listener who had contacted him saying, I've been listening to the programs and I want to know more about Christ. He went to see him and he was attacked by a group of people and almost lost his life. And we managed to get him to the hospital and he was saved, but he's attacked with knives. So it's very dangerous to be a believer in these parts of the world. So we have a 500,000 watt AM station very close to there. It's in one of the Stan countries, Uzbekistan, to Turkmenistan, in Central Asia. I won't say exactly where it is, but this transmitter is there. It's ours, and we can use it every day, and we're broadcasting into that part of the world. And in Afghanistan, we're broadcasting in Pashtun, and we have quite a lot of people that are responding. The way they respond is they contact us by phone, and then we tell them of a Skype address, and then we talk to them by Skype. We have an organization that partners with us that does all of the follow-up. And today they're starting Bible studies in Afghanistan over Skype, because Skype's encrypted, and so it's safe for those who are using it. And so we are actually having Bible studies, working for that lasting fruit in Afghanistan. And also Pakistan and northern India is a big part of our ministry there. And we have had quite a few people who have contacted us and want to become followers of Jesus Christ. They want to become believers and put their faith in Him because of listening to the broadcasts. Now, I've done a lot of, before COVID, I would disappear quite a bit. I would be gone a lot. And so where was I going and what do I do in Transworld Radio? Well, my title is Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I grew up in Ecuador and Peru, and so I speak Spanish. And so I do a lot of work in Latin America. And when I became a teenager, I was also very interested in electronics and in technical things. And so I went to Conestoga College in Ontario, and I got my degree in electronic technology. And so I had technical skills. And when I met Barbara, we talked about our desires and future, and I had a desire in my heart to use my technical skills for missions. And Barbara, she too had felt from a young age that she wanted to be in missions. So when we got married, we worked for a few years, and then we applied to Transworld Radio, and we were sent to Monte Carlo. And Jasmine was a year old when we went over there. It was the longest plane trip of my life. She didn't sleep the whole trip. And anyways, we spent 12 years in Monte Carlo, and then we came back to Canada. I worked for about 5 years here in Canada as representing the organization out in British Columbia. And then when Jasmine and Aaron went off to college, we went back to the field. We worked in the US and we went to Europe again. So we've been 18 years in Europe, 12 years in the US, and about 5 years in Canada, and then we moved here 3 years ago. And so I continued to do my work in Latin America, and I do it from my base, using the base of St. John as a base. On the next slide, and I'll try and go real quickly here, because it's one of the problems with missionaries, is you get the missionary talking about their ministry and they can hardly get them to shut up. But one of the places that I go to a lot when I'm not here is the island of Bonaire. And the island of Bonaire is just 60 kilometers off the coast of Venezuela. You've heard of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, ABC Islands. Aruba, Curacao, people know about. Bonaire, not so many. But it's a little island there, and we have a 500,000 watt transmitter there. It's actually the strongest AM transmitter in the Western Hemisphere. We just brought it online. We powered it up in 2018. And it broadcasts all through the Caribbean. And one of our big focuses there is Cuba. And so we are, every evening, starting from 8 o'clock in the evening till about midnight, we blanket the entire island of Cuba with Christian programming. So on the next slide, you can see places where we've received responses from that broadcast. And the next slide is just an image of Cuba. I was in Cuba a couple years ago, and I took this picture, and to me this just typifies Cuba. The old cars, the old Havana, and then somebody on their cell phone. And Cuba is today a country that is, the church is growing very, very strong in Cuba today. There is, I spoke to one person at a missions conference who was leading a church in Cuba, a denomination in Cuba, and they said that they had 130 churches planted in their denomination within the last few years in Cuba. These aren't huge churches, they're smaller churches, but the church is growing. And one of the problems is that without seminaries, without good Bible institutes, and also there aren't good concordances and commentaries and such in Cuba, and so a lot of the pastors really need theological training. And a lot of people are leading churches with very, very basic theological understanding and training. So our programming is actually, we have a lot of programs that deal with systematic through the Bible teaching, and this has been a real help to a lot of the churches in Cuba and a lot of those who are leading those churches. This next picture is Alberto Gonzalez, and he's our man in Cuba. And Alberto was interned by the communist regime of Cuba when he was in seminary, and he was sent to a labor camp cutting sugarcane because he was in theological training. He was very discouraged, and he began listening to the radio, found Bonaire. He was already a believer, but the broadcast from Bonaire really encouraged and lifted him up. And he decided that he was going to commit his life to teaching and preaching the gospel in Cuba, and that he was going to stay in Cuba and propagate and do as much as he could for the gospel. And then eventually, he also prayed that one day he would be able to work for Transworld Radio. And today he works for us. And on this next slide is a man I met when I was in Cuba, Alex Sadie. And Alex Sadie is just a really wonderful guy. He heard the broadcasts from Cuba. Him and his wife became believers. And he lost his job because he said out loud that he was a Christian. So when he lost his job, he said to his wife, well, now we can work in ministry. So they started a church. And then also he has a donkey cart, and he goes off through the hills and through the mountains and has groups of people that he ministers to. But wherever he goes, he has them tune into the radio broadcasts from Bonaire, because he can only visit them maybe once a month. But in between his visits, every day they can listen to good Bible teaching over the radio. So this is just an example of our ministry, our global ministry of Transworld Radio that we're involved in. I'd just like to finish off with a few verses from Matthew. You know, a lot of mission speakers, we always talk about the Great Commission. And I don't think you can go to a missions conference without either the theme being Matthew chapter 28 or somebody talking about the Great Commission. And the Great Commission is when Jesus' final words to his disciples, telling them to go into the world and preach the gospel. But the Great Commission actually begins, the whole idea begins in the verses leading up to that Great Commission. And actually in the beginning of the chapter, in chapter 28 of Matthew, it says, after the Sabbath at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, they shook and became like dead. The angel said to the woman, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly, and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. So you can just imagine Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, the heaviness on their hearts. The Savior has been crucified, and just what is going through their hearts. And then the angel tells them some amazing good news. He's not dead, he's alive, he's risen. And he says, go. And he sends them off. He says, go tell others. Here's this amazing good news, this amazing story. And the angel says, go and tell others. And the gospel is not just for our own comfort. The gospel is not just for our own use and for our own encouragement. I can imagine how encouraged and uplifted the two Marys were when they heard that Jesus was alive. But the message wasn't just for them. It was for the disciples as well. And then later, Jesus told the disciples, this message is for the whole world. So we should never look at the gospel as just something to give us a better life, to give us knowledge of Christ. It's something that's meant to be shared. And then we have the Great Commission and actually on the way to tell the disciples, the women meet Jesus. And Jesus then says, go and tell the disciples. So there's two goes before we finally get to the Great Commission, which is another go. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And that's what I really love about that verse, that commission is, and surely I am with you to the very end of the age. And as we work in missions, as we work in Transworld Radio, we know that God is with us, and He will be with us till the end of the age. So as you listen to radio, as you turn on a radio, don't just listen to the radio. Think about Transworld Radio. Think about what we're trying to do around the world, and uphold us in prayer before the Lord, that He will continue to enable us and provide for us. Thank you.